Good morning, welcome, and my thanks go to ESCAP and ADB for organizing this meeting. What I will do this morning as an introduction is I will evoke the relevant paragraphs of the Trade Facilitation Agreement with regard to single window. And I am not a negotiator in Geneva. I'm very happy that I'm not doing it. The Singapore issues date back till I think 96, and I don't think I would have had the patience of staying in this process for the whole time. So I will look at this Singapore issues and the trade facilitation and the single window components of that agreement from an implementer's point of view. What does it mean for implementing single windows? The core paragraph on single window in the Trade Facilitation Agreement is Article 10, and I call the Article 10 the single window article because the different paragraphs of the Article 10 are all related to core aspects of the single window implementation. The single window itself is in Article 10.4. And if we look into the difference between the GATT articles and the Trade Facilitation Agreement, in the Article 10 has evolved out of the discussion around the Article 8 in the GATT agreement. And in Article 8 in the GATT agreement, we had a rather timid reference to trade facilitation instruments, at least when it comes to information management in international supply chains. I think the connotation of information management was simply not on the agenda when the GATT articles were formed. So GATT Article 8 said the contracting parties also recognize the need for minimizing incidents and complexity of import and export formalities and for decreasing and simplifying import and export requirements. So this article is now much further elaborated, and we find much more details in the Trade Facilitation Agreement that directly evoke information management and use of information technology in international supply chains. So Article 10 focuses on formalities and documentary requirements, acceptance of paper copies of original documents and electronic documents, the use of international standards, and in paragraph 4, the recommendation to set up a single window. If we go straight into Article 4, Article 4 has 4.1 has two components. One component is, you could see it as a recommendation to establish a single window. As we saw in the presentation from the ITC on the first day of the forum, there's 3 levels of commitment in the GATT agreement, in the Trade Facilitation Agreement. One is the word shall, which is binding. Another one is an encouragement, and word encouraged is used. And then we have something that we could consider as a qualified binding requirement, for example, shall endeavor to establish. So we have a recommendation, a guidance to governments to make a serious effort to work towards an implementation of a single window. And then we have a definition of what a single window is in the context of this text. A single window is enabling traders to submit documentation or data requirements for importation, export, and transit of goods through a single entry point. So until now, the main lead recommendation for implementation of single window was the UNECE recommendation 33. this definition of a single window is very close to the UNECE recommendation of a single window. Main difference is that in the Trade Facilitation Agreement, we're talking about the participating authorities or agencies. So the scope of the single window is limited to whoever the government has designed or invited to participate in the single window. The scope of Recommendation 33 talks about all regulatory documents for import and export. So this is much, much wider. The second component of the Article 4 goes then into what is happening once the documents have been submitted to the single window and have been examined by the authorities. And so the article says that the results, the trader, the importer, the exporter, should be notified through this mechanism of the single window, and so he has a one-stop shop, if you want, to receive information on whether his documents have been accepted and what is the results of the examination of the documents. So the single window here becomes a central communication point for the exporter and importer to deal with the authorities that are connected to the single window. The Article 10.4, the second part, then looks into the idea of reuse of data. So the article says that if data has already been submitted to the... Okay, thank you. If data has already been submitted to the single window in forms of documents, then this data should be shared among these participating authorities or agencies. And that also includes what the agreement calls data requirements, so electronically submitted information. Now, when it comes to paper documents or scanned copies of paper documents, it is relatively easy in practice to share these documents through a common database with the participating agencies. I just want to mention it is a completely different issue if you want to reuse electronic data. Why? In a paper document, the data elements in the paper document are qualified. They are contextualized through the context of this trade document. If you distract from the paper document and you have electronic data, you don't know anymore in which context this electronic data has been submitted. But the context gives a lot of meaning to data. So to give you an example, you could have agriculture quality certificate, and that says we are exporting 1 ton of cherries. You could then say, okay, after I get this quality certificate, the container goes to customs, so I could take this information, amount of goods that are going to be exported, 1,000 kilograms, and feed that straight away into the customs declaration. But in the meantime, maybe the exporter has received an urgent fax from his importer, and the importer said, I just need 500 kilos. So he has taken out 500 kilos from the consignment. So you cannot just like this take the data that is valid and completely correct for one document and put it into another document. So you need to contextualize data, and that means you need a data model. And the development of data models is a complex task because, for some of these reasons that I mentioned, in ASEAN they have worked very long on the development of these data models. And so the reuse of data, also it is a very useful provision, is something that when it comes to the electronic world needs a lot of elaboration and a lot of engineering and process analysis. Okay. Article 4.3, I find this is a very interesting provision. It says that the members that implement the single window shall notify the committees on the details of the operation of the single window. And I'm really curious to see how this article, what this article will bring for us as implementers. Because until now, we don't have a structured way to receive information how single windows around the world are operating. UNECE, ESCAP, we do a lot of surveys and we receive information, but here we have for the first time a provision which requires members to provide detailed information about the operation of the single windows. And I think if that works out, then it would help us also to move forward and say, okay, if we have this type of single window in one country, this is the operation of a single window in another country, how can we link the operations of single window? And that brings us then to the question of single window to single window interoperability. So maybe this provision opens a path into single window interoperability, something that we sometimes talk about until now, but we haven't really started to tackle. And the last paragraph is then saying that members should use information technology wherever possible and practical for the operation of the single window. I think there's not much discussion about it. Single windows and management of information in international trade today just depends on the use of information technology, and this is available also for developing and least developed countries. It's not the technology that is the problem and the issue, it is the integration of technology into regulatory environments, into the business processes, and into the change management of people. Okay, so I've showed you what's in the agreement. Maybe briefly on what is not in the agreement anymore, what dropped out in the course of the negotiations. There was a provision that the operation of single windows should be based on relevant international standards. If it's not in, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be based on relevant international standards. And also we have, and I'll go to this, we have other parts of this Article 10 that discuss international standards. The second component that is not in anymore is the idea of a dynamic development of a single window, the progression of a single window. I think it's still part of this, implicitly part of the Article 10.4, because it, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's talking about the participating government agencies, and I think there's implicitly an idea behind it that as a single window is implemented, there will be more and more government agencies that join this single window. I also want to mention here the concept of the single window evolution that was developed and discussed on conferences in Geneva and here in Bangkok over the last 2 years, where we don't see a single window as a one-time effort of a country to implement an automated system, but rather as a continuous effort to establish collaboration of government agencies and to use information technology for this type of collaboration. Other articles, other components of Article 10 that relate strongly to single window. We have 10.1 on formalities and document requirements. So the articles calls for to minimize incidents and complexity, both of the procedures and of the documentation requirements. And this is highly relevant for single window. You can only organize collaboration between government agencies if you know what the procedures are, if you have documented these procedures and everybody has agreed that this is what needs to be done and the way how it is done. And only then you can start off changing regulation and automate this exchange of information for putting these procedures into place. Just some of the trade facilitation instruments and tools that we have. Simplification of business processes. So we have business process analysis, which is very successful, used by the member countries, in particular here in the Asia-Pacific region. We have simplification and alignment of trade documents, the UNECE standards like UN Layout Key and the United Nations Trade Data Element Directory. And then, of course, we have all the e-business standards like core component technology or the WCO data model. Provision 10.2, acceptance of copies. It calls for members to accept paper originals, copies of paper originals, and electronic copies of the supporting documents. Again, this is hugely relevant for single window. Any single window will need to go away from the use of paper documents and at least implement the use of scanned copies of digital images of documents, and from there on, of course, to electronic submission of customs declarations, manifests, and so on. Now, if you go into a country, you will always have someone that says proudly, we have a bill and that allows use of electronic documents for import and export procedures. But then if you go to the customs office, you still see stacks and stacks of paper. So what is happening very often is that the subtle business processes that are behind export and import formalities in reality don't allow an exporter to use copies of documents or scanned copies, digital images of documents. So just to give you an example, customs organizations will accept scanned copies of supporting documents, but in case there's a documentary check of the consignment, the documentary checks are done on original documents. Now, if you have 5 or 10% of documentary checks of the consignment, and you have submitted a scanned copy of your invoice, then it means that you get a call from the customs officers. They need the original documents for the documentary check, and then you have to send a driver from the premises of your company through the traffic jam to the customs house. And if he doesn't arrive before the closure of the customs offices, then your consignment sits there for another day. So what do you do? Well, of course, also you could submit electronic copies of documents. In reality, you will submit the paper documents. And because it's easier, you will submit them through a customs broker. So also the customs broker is not mandatory. It's effectively necessary because the customs broker has the original documents. So with this provision, we get again a much stronger drive to take these paper documents out of the importation and exportation process, and to allow the practical procedures to be based on alternatives, on the images of these documents, and from there on electronic documents like XML or Edifact documents. Okay, and then finally we have a provision 10.3, use of international standards, recommends member countries to implement international standards or to use international standards for their import and export procedures. And for us as UNECE, as a standard setting organizations, we love the second part of this paragraph. It really calls for member countries to participate in the standard setting process or at least, if they cannot afford it, to review the development of new international standards and look how they can implement new or how they can use new standards, new approaches, new technologies in their import and export procedures. Okay, this is of course highly relevant for single window, and I also hope that further use of standards in single window will help on the long run to create interoperability between the single windows, data exchange from one country directly in electronic format to other countries. If you just briefly look into how member countries are looking into the single window provision, I'm using here a study from UNCTAD, and UNCTAD has supported through the negotiation process member countries in drawing up plans on how they could implement, on their readiness to implement the provisions of this agreement. And through this process, UNCTAD has had a number of documents where member countries have analyzed their readiness, and they compiled this in a study study is available on the internet, New Frontier of Competitiveness Implementing Trade Facilitation. And in the study, the different measures where the readiness of countries for the different measures were analyzed. Single window in the study is measure 29, and it is one of the measures that is the least implemented measure of all measures in the trade facilitation agreement. So single window is perhaps a top level measure, that is, it depends on the implementation of a lot of other measures. Single window pulls together a lot of trade facilitation activities, a lot of trade facilitation legislation and efforts. So I think it shouldn't surprise us that this is the last thing, the last brick in the wall that is then implemented. Also, the study found that single window is both for the least developed countries and for non-least developed countries, it's one of the issues that is least implemented. So the views of the LDCs and the developing countries are not so different on single window. The main reasons for the instruments that have not been implemented so far is lack of resources, lack of a legal framework, interagency cooperation, and lack of understanding of the benefits, and lack in ICT and infrastructure. Now, when it comes to single window, the most quoted reasons is lack of existing of a legal framework, lack of resources, and lack of interagency cooperation. So I think in particular the issue of interagency cooperation is one of the hardest issues to tackle in single window. And I would like to stress the fact that at the end of the day, a single window is about interagency cooperation. All other aspects of a single window are secondary aspects in order to achieve this goal. Information technology, reuse of information, and so on and so forth, they all serve one purpose: provide a platform that agencies and the private sector can better organize their business processes. Okay? That's also interesting, some of the boxes that were not ticked, for example, lack of understanding and knowledge on the measure. I would take this also as a result of the efforts that have been made by UNECE and by ADB on discussing with member countries over the couple of years on what single window is and what it is good for and what countries can get out of it. Also, countries are fully aware about the difficulties in implementing it. It is still a top priority of countries to implement. So this is definitely, single window is definitely something that countries want to go for. The average time to implement a single window is seen to take about 3 to 4 years. Now, I would take that result a little bit with caution, because at the end the question is, what are you aiming for in your single window? How many government agencies do you want to connect? How deep in the interaction and automation of this interrelationship between these government agencies do you want to go? And of course, this then determines the time for implementation. And of course, the same is true also when you ask about the costs. The costs really depend on the level of automation and the depth of business process integrations that you want to achieve. Member countries here in the study were looking at about $3 million for the implementation of a single window. Single window is also the measure in the agreement where the countries see the highest level for technical assistance and capacity building, also not surprising. Okay, and seeing that I took a big chunk of the time, thank you very much, and I will stop here.